All right, good morning and afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the National Council's webinar with our strategic partner, MTM Services, called Implementing Rapid Change in the COVID Era, Part 1. My name is Amber Williams, and I'm a communications manager for the National Council, and I will serve as your moderator today. Keep in mind that today's webinar is currently being recorded, and you're in listen-only mode. Depending on your settings, today's presentation may be in a speaker view or gallery view, and a setting to toggle between views will be at the top right corner. You may send us questions for the speakers at any time during today's webinar. We do plan to hold a Q&A at the end, and we'll answer as many of your questions as time allows. Within 48 hours, an audio version of today's presentation and the slides of today's webinar will be available on our website at thenationalcouncil.org. Speaking on today's call from MTM Services, we have Charlie Grantham, IT and Process Optimization Consultant, Michael Flora, he's a Senior Management and Operations Consultant, and David Swann, who is a Senior Integrated Healthcare Consultant. And now I'm going to turn it over to you, Charlie.
All right, thank you. Again, this is Charlie Grantham. Welcome, and thank you everyone for giving us a little bit of your time today to talk about how we can implement rapid change in the COVID area. We do have 3 speakers today. I'm going to be the first part, talking a little bit about how we set up telehealth in your home office while maintaining HIPAA compliance. Before we do that, I will say a little bit about MTM Services. At MTM Services, we have a full suite of consultants that have worked with thousands of you and thousands of facilities across the country since the mid-90s. So we look forward to taking what we have learned across that time and being able to give you some of that today. Really, when we talk about telehealth, the first thing is about, how do we present ourselves in such a way that it's professional and is like it is in the office setting. We really want to be as transparent as we can. And that starts really with the camera position and the lighting. And we're going to start by talking about the camera position. Really the optimal position for the camera is directly in front of your face to slightly elevate it. I've tried to give us a few pictures to look at here with some representative samples. I'm sorry the model's no better than he is, but unfortunately that's all I've got to work with. With that optimal position in the front of the face, it's important that we avoid those low camera angles. If you're genetically based or blessed with a turkey neck like me, certainly low camera angles can be very unflattering. Another thing to think about is landscape. Many of us are using our phones to do some of this telehealth. Even with our clients, it can be important that we take that, make sure that we're taking that phone and flipping it to the side so that we get as much of the picture of both the person and the surroundings as we can. Now, let's talk a second about lighting. Really, the optimal lighting solution is multiple diffused light sources. Now, I could probably talk for about 16 hours about how to do proper lighting with some people, but really the idea is that to have that diffused light that is reflecting, whether it is from a lampshade or an overhead light with a globe that gives you that diffusion. That's what will make you have the best picture and present your best video possible. Another thing is to watch out for those reflections. Now, whether it's the reflection that you see there in my glasses or the reflections of, what people see that might be distracting in a photograph or a picture that's hanging on the wall behind you. Maybe if you've got a mirror in your room or something like that, be careful of what the camera can see. Also, be sure to avoid that bright backlighting. Remember that if you're in a room with, a window, your lighting may change from the morning to the evening. And as your day goes by, the lighting may need to be adjusted by adjusting your curtains in a certain way, differently in the morning versus the afternoon. Now, what about that camera's eye? It's really all seeing. It sees everything that's behind you. So be mindful of what is behind you. You know, make sure that there's no information or nothing that anybody can see that you don't want them to see. And, you know, also be careful about who is behind you. This is a very big HIPAA concern. You know, make sure that people aren't looking over your shoulder, that you are keeping your workspace at home, much like your workspace at the office, you know, as private as you can. Many of the technologies, much like Zoom that we're using right now, allows you to have those virtual backgrounds. Make sure that you don't use virtual backgrounds that can be distracting. Now, I'm certainly have found my Zen here in this picture, but just be mindful of what those virtual backgrounds can do. Now, with that said, you can use those virtual backgrounds in a positive way. You know, perhaps you want to do some branding or have some information that's available to your clients, maybe the goals or something like that. You could pop those up as a background as you end your session. There's a lot of different ways you can take the technology and leverage it to make it more impactful for your clients. Now, what about, you know, hearing and being heard? Can you hear me now? You know, the importance of audio. Audio is either 50% in the case of, you know, a video teleconference, or 100% in the case of a telephone call of telehealth. Now, here in this picture, you see Charlie in his normal habitat. I wear full over-the-ear headphones, and I have a boom microphone that works off my ear there. I like to have, you know, my equipment wired in because I want to be able to hear and speak and be heard as easily as possible. But whatever technology you choose, whether it is earbobs or whether you're using you know, a Bluetooth device or multiple different devices, make sure that it's comfortable. Chances are you're going to be using the telehealth for hours during the day, and ear fatigue can be a terrible thing. So just be mindful of that and try to get something that is not only useful, but also comfortable. And also always have a backup. You'll see here in the little picture in the bottom left there, those are the cords I need to use my laptop with my equipment, or to use my phone, or to hook stuff up different ways. So always have that stuff at hand, because of course it's going to mess up at the worst possible moment. The other thing is, remember, and this is especially important about HIPAA, is keep those conversations private. Whatever kind of technology you're using for your microphones, chances are they're very perceptive, you might say. So it's okay to just speak in low tones. Make sure that you close the door so that those outside of your home office, as much as you can, you don't get distracted by those noises. That can be very much a common thing these days, but try to be mindful of what's going on in the background, you know. And with that said, avoid the use of speakerphone mode. That speakerphone mode actually makes your microphone more perceptive because it knows that it's going to be further away from your mouth. So that can enhance that sort of problematic thing about the audio. So what are some tips to make it work for staff and clients alike? Well, the first thing is that really nobody likes the shaky cam. We can't have people holding their phones and trying to conduct a session. That can really be distracting. So what are some strategies to really make sure that that doesn't happen? You might consider some inexpensive tripods or phone mounts for phones. There's also lighting, like you might see there in the center. That is a light ring that allows you to have a phone with, you know, some lighting to give you a better video picture. Things about audio to be concerned about is, first of all, be ready for audio problems when they happen, because they're going to happen. And that also means understanding kind of what goes on and what a solution might be. For example, if you hear a lot of echo in a video conference, usually that means that someone is on the phone and they also have their computer speakers on, so you get a feedback loop going. A little bit of, you know, learning about those and trading those sort of solutions off with your peers can go a long way to make sure that your sessions run fast and easy. One thing about sound transmission, if you've got your phone on the table and it goes off and vibrates, it's going to be loud as the dickens. Remember that sound travels through everything that it touches, and that can be another reason why having a little inexpensive tripod or phone mount can isolate the phone and give you better sound. Also, notification reduction methods. There's ways you can take your phone, if you've got good Wi-Fi, you can put it in airplane mode and still keep the Wi-Fi on so that you're able to still have your meeting, but not have any of those other distractions. So, are there other technology related considerations that we need to think about for a dispersed workforce? Well, of course there are. Anytime we take things out from underneath the protective arms of our building, that can offer us some significant risk. Now, when I talk about keeping devices up to date, that works for your devices at home and also your devices from work. Many of you have taken your laptops from work home and not gone back to work for some time. My guess is that some of your technical folks are about to cringe when you get to 60 and 90 days when those devices haven't checked back in with their central systems to make sure that they have updates and stuff like that. You need to think about that now and how you can plan to make sure that you're able to bring this equipment back in and keep it up to date. Same thing with your home systems. Make sure that if you're using them, make sure they're up to date. Also, your Wi-Fi, your routers, those types of things can be very important to make sure that you've got them up to date. And what are other security measures that you can use? Many of you are using the equipment and the technology that is by your facility. You can also do other layers yourself, whether it's a personal VPN. Those are great ways to give yourself extra added security as we move in this telehealth environment. The other thing is sort of just a HIPAA little hint is we're still probably having paper at home. And some of that paper at home may have PHI or PII on it. Make sure you're putting that in your own personal shred bin, even if you have to take it back to work like I do and drop it into the big shred bin. Think about all of those different things and how you protect PHI in your work office and how that translates into your home office. All right, with that said, I'll pass it over to Michael to talk to us about collaborative documentation.
Thank you, Charlie. Hello, everybody. I'm Michael Flora. It's a pleasure to be back with you again today as we look at conducting your session using collaborative documentation in a telehealth environment. A couple things to think about is, when you talk about setting this up at home, whether it's in the office, as Charlie said, with your phone, with your equipment, review the goals and objectives. So if I'm starting off today with Charlie as my client today, I'm going to start reviewing the goals and objectives for today's session. It's going to be pretty easy right now for many of your clinicians and consumers to sort of start going in other directions as part of our session today. Please remember the golden thread. Everything starts with the assessment. From the assessment to the assessed needs, to the treatment plan, the goals, the objectives, to the intervention. So today's intervention, what are we doing today? How will that relate to your treatment goals? We know that many consumers right now might be very anxious or cautious or fearful. That's okay. Can we tie that back to a specific goal or objective we're going to work with today? As Charlie said, know your equipment. What can I do with my equipment today? Will it work today? Practice in supervision with a peer. That's one of the things that I've always recommended with collaborative documentation, that supervisors or peers work with collaborative documentation. Can we work with you today? Can I pull up a note? Can we practice today? So when I do have my session with my consumer, whether I'm community-based staff that's now working remotely through my home office or a clinician that's now working from home, practice. Develop your scripts on what you will say and how you will say it. And so thinking about as we introduce this to consumers or families in the new healthcare environment, just as we would provide collaborative documentation in the office, we're going to know our scripts. So something like, as you usually know, I write our note after you leave my office. Now that we have moved to a telehealth session, not only will you be able to see me and we'll see each other, but we'll also be able to see my screen. So again, develop your scripts. Introduce this as a new session format. Introduce the client format of the session. So is it telephonic? Is it video? How will we be working today? And then conduct your session like you normally would. So here you can see my colleague Joy Fruth, and she and I did a collaborative documentation session that's on our COVID page of the MTM Services website. But you would just bring up the session so both of us can see each other. We're going to conduct our session like we normally would. We're going to bring up the goals, the objectives, how are things going. You're going to do your introduction. And then I'm going to pull up my note at the end of the session. So we're going to, what goals did we work on today? What interventions did we work on today? So you can see that I can see Joy, she can see me, and we can now also see the note. But it's also, can I move that video screen up into the corner? Can we move things around so we can all see the session together? Remember, collaborative documentation is not that you are a court stenographer and you're typing every single word the client is saying. Collaborative documentation really is nothing about me without me. And so we could do this in supervision. And supervisors, managers, you can model collaborative documentation by doing your supervision logs and supervision notes with the team member with you or in a team meeting. And so model that experience with them. With consumers, it's important to introduce this as something new. And we've been doing this for about 3-4 weeks now. Many teams that have been doing collaborative documentation have found this very easy to move to collaborative. Charlie? And so collaborative documentation, go ahead, Charlie, hit the next one. It is really looking at, for us to remember as part of this technology. As Charlie said, it's great when it works, but what's your backup plan? Do as much as you can. I think that's important as we transition our team members to documenting collaboratively and providing sessions remotely in the new environment. Completing a portion of the note in the session as you're starting out is okay, just simply to do more and more each time. One of the things I like to recommend is to start with the plan. What's the plan for next week? Use your best clinical judgment. We know that collaborative documentation does not work with every client in every situation. That's okay. And we want to try to do collaborative about 90 to 93% of the time, which is what we call the 7% rule. With 7%, it may not be clinically appropriate. And so one of the things we want to work on with consumers in this new environment is use our best clinical judgment. If we're not comfortable with it, the client will not be comfortable with it. So we have to make sure that we're supportive of our team members in this new environment. I'm now going to introduce my colleague, David Swann, who's our Senior Healthcare Integration Consultant. David?
Thank you, Michael, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone, whichever part of the country you're in. It's good to be with you all today also to help out. I realize that so many of you probably had to ramp up telehealth really, really quickly. Many people, maybe even on the call, have been my clients, that I've worked with. Some of you who, if you have brought up telehealth in the last 6 years ago when I started helping organizations do that with MTM, then you might have said today, well, this is a really good thing that we did that a long time ago. And then many of you, again, are having to do that really quickly. So we have a lot of respect and honesty about that and understanding. I'm going to be talking about some of the unusual circumstances or unique circumstances, keeping in mind that quality, safety, and standards of care and effectiveness are what we're all about with telehealth. So first off, the expectations of telehealth is really important, and you see the little cartoon character there about what is it that you can and can't do. And I think this is really helpful. I suggest that there be a pre-treatment experience using telehealth with a client that actually should be individual in nature to help them to set expectations. So even if the client is going to go into a group telehealth experience, start with some kind of preparation for them to set expectations. So this helps to answer some of the questions that we hear about from a lot of people across the country, is about how do we do this? How do we make this work if we actually haven't done it before? So now some people are actually going to be brand new to any kind of telehealth, and they're going to follow and model your behavior. So this sets us, the clinicians, in a very important role. We need to be very comfortable. So all the things that Charlie did and stated, and how Michael helped us to understand how we do our documentation and our participation, very important that we do a lot of participation and get comfortable with telehealth on our own, including using peers, as Michael had suggested earlier, in order to get ourselves ready for telehealth. You might even inquire when you're having this kind of pre-treatment service, that what has been a client's previous experience with telehealth, if they have had that before. Particularly ask them the question, have they had it for primary care or behavioral health care? I did this recently in the state of Kansas, and for any of you who are from Kansas, you might find this fascinating, particularly recently, but that about a third of the audience raised their hand when I asked them if they had used telehealth in the last 12 months for either themselves or for a loved one. So it's becoming more and more popular. The safety, the quality, and the client protections and all the standards of care that we speak about all the time are expected from telehealth, and there is no difference than what we do in in-person care. So let's just state that right up front. This is really important to get across. A lot of the questions I get sometimes are, well, this has to be different. This has to be different. We can't do the same things. We can't expect the same things. And the quality aspects of this are that it should be identical and exactly that same. When also this allows us to start setting norms in order to help avoid some of the challenges. So Charlie talked about a lot of the usefulness and the helpfulness of things of using the technology from the client's perspective and from our perspective as well. So again, we're modeling that type of good behavior. So the appearance of the client, the appearance of the clinician, how to use the technology, the confidentiality, the privacy at the location, the language that we choose to use, and any kind of threats. Again, these should be really strongly considered. And again, these are some of the challenges a lot of people bring to me about how we do this and how we solve those kind of problems. Don't forget too that the really good things that this really accentuates are the ability to engage clients through video and audio technology, the use of motivational interviewing, and any CBT techniques. Again, frequently research-bound find that telehealth does really well when you use these three things. But a lot of people do ask that question, how do we engage when using telehealth? Well, it's very highly important that happen. We're going to talk about a few of those things as we go on. So the best things that we can say too about some of these negative experiences with clients and with telehealth is to prevent them as best as you can. And so I usually give a lot of suggestions to my clients about how to prevent these. So particularly even thinking about group therapy, and I have a lot of questions about group because it's been one of those real radical thoughts is that you can do group therapy with telehealth. Well, yes, you can. In fact, you probably know, and you've seen commercials even on television. You watch any TV, you're going to see something like this, where group therapy is probably one of the most popular things done by telehealth in the country today. But one negative experience with one client within a group, again, can have an impact on all the other members. This risk is really multiplied by the number of group members, so we need to prevent it. So when I talk about that pre-treatment opportunity to set expectations and help people to adapt to telehealth, this should be considered as an orientation. And I think this is a treatment episode. This is a treatment encounter. It's just prior to getting into whatever their primary mode of treatment is, if it's going to be individual, family, or group therapy. But it starts to prevent some of these things. So we're going to talk about crisis management just a little bit, but all the things that we would be interested in are to make sure that we get the right setup and the right types of engagement for the clients so that we set those expectations. So if we can do the right prevention, we can anticipate and then get ahead of these problems again. And so I spend a lot of time with organizations about setting norms and rules so particularly the privacy and confidentiality for all the patients. So what we should do is to really encourage, if not mandate, all the patients or clients to arrange for a private space to attend group or individual services through telehealth. Whatever that is, to make sure that they have their own private space. This could really go bad if their private information is overheard by other people that shouldn't hear that and don't have permission to do that and may even choose to use that information. This is particularly difficult for people that live in a group home space or in a long-term care center or something like that, where the services may not be in an individual home. Or as we've seen, if they're trying to do their treatment at a kitchen table with other people milling around. So the need to inform others in the home or the location to avoid disturbing the group member or the individual client, you know, that's receiving treatment. So they need to be able to have a door to shut, even a door to lock. We even recommend like signage on the door that you can put on the door, say privacy, or please do not disturb, something like that, that really helps to preserve that privacy for the client. Think about this too, is when you're going to be trying to get ahead of these problems. I've had a lot of experiences where the clothing or the appearance of the client is inappropriate for this treatment, and that they actually may not wear that particular clothing when they would come to the office. But we're in their space. We have to remember this, that this is their home, this is their space where they're receiving treatment. So we might set that norm of saying, now, when you're going to be doing this telehealth, I want you to have the appearance as if you were to come to the office. And if they struggle with that, even what about when they go to work? Whatever the work attire they may wear may be more appropriate again. So think about those examples of clothing and appearance. You want to make sure that people understand that the attendance and participation norms in treatment are going to be the same as if they were receiving treatment in an office space. So nothing about that changes by using telehealth, but there are some clients that kind of do take on a different attitude about telehealth. And so it's incumbent upon us as the professionals to help set those expectations. Have them to practice with the technology at least once. That can really help. You heard from Charlie about all the challenges that we have to overcome. It happens so frequently that the audio or the video is not working properly on the client's end. So practicing with it to give them some positive experience first before treatment gets really going, that can be really helpful. And that can offset spending the first 15 to 20 minutes of a treatment session just trying to get, you know, the whole service functioning. In particular, if this is a group, that would be distraction for the entire group, for all the people that were successful with the audio or video, with just one member that was not. And again, plan for technology failure. Charlie said it, you know, it happens to us. We use this kind of technology we're using right here today to do a lot of our consulting work. And it, you know, probably once a month, something happens to this and we have to regroup and we have to do something. What is the plan? So if someone, for example, couldn't join a video conference through Zoom or whatever the technology platform, have a phone number that they can call in and even just participate by telephone. Even if we lose that opportunity to bill and get paid for it, the person still can get the treatment. So that's what's important. So make sure that we plan for technology failures. Have a primary, secondary, and even a tertiary plan to make that happen. So these unique circumstances are what I get a lot of questions about. So one of them comes up around crisis. You know, what happens when we're seeing somebody in person and they have a crisis they come in with, versus when we're doing this with telehealth and we somehow, you know, we're going to be more frightened and more apprehensive of the person who's having the crisis within their own home, let's say. So again, planning and prearranging is one of the great things. So you first want to do this, think ahead. So when you're assessing, and Michael talked about the golden thread, when you assess a client, you want to be assessing them for their telehealth responsiveness. Now, you may not have a choice right now as to whether they can be seen by you, particularly via telehealth or in person. So if you don't have that choice, you're forcing them into this situation, even though they may be that one of those rare people that we may not want to use telehealth if given that choice. But nonetheless, let's assume that we have to use telehealth for all of our clients, just in this kind of just for this kind of argument. So try to prepare ahead. Is someone prone to crisis events? Have they ever attempted or thought or considered suicide in the past? Do they need a crisis plan? All of those things may be done and completed during that assessment, which may help you to decide, number one, whether this person would benefit from telehealth or not. Maybe you should refer them to somebody who is not doing telehealth. It's not, may not even be with your organization, but it may be within your community, but a proper referral may be important. Also, the idea that could we help to intervene with them if they had a crisis, if we had a plan with them. So we know we have a lot of advanced directives going on with people with behavioral health conditions now. So what we want to do is to make sure that we consider that. So one of the things that I usually recommend is for anybody that maybe for anybody that's going to be receiving care with telehealth, but particularly somebody who might have a chance of having a crisis, that we get the telephone number and a contact name of maybe 1, 2, or 3 people that in one of those needs to live or reside close to this client. You get permission from the client ahead of time to talk to those people when and if that person might be in a crisis. You could then contact the person and send them over to wherever that they're at. You see how this could be as a preventative intervention. This could be a family member. It could be somebody in their own home. It could be a next door neighbor, just somebody to check on them. Of course, you always have 911 and we always have law enforcement. We always have these well checks, but I consider those to be some of the last kind of resort efforts that maybe we might have a better planned event first. And the second bullet here, again, if we see someone or experience someone that's escalating in behavior, and someone needs someone to be with them, that's when we want to maybe try to do this. We might want to have a contact, somebody that we can contact to help them out. A third option here, or in the third bullet, is they could have a hosted telehealth service also. Now, hosted means when there is a staff member there, it may not be you, the primary clinical person that is delivering healthcare. It may be somebody else. It may be a case manager or something like that, but you do something special for this person, particularly if they're prone to having these crisis events. So I think we're going to move to questions and answers. I think I'm going to turn it over to Amanda right now, just for a moment. Amanda?
Hey, this is Amber again. And so guys, go ahead and submit your questions. We're going to open the floor right now for them. And I just want to thank you for submitting your questions in advance too. That was very helpful for us getting this webinar set up and together. The first question I do see is that will the webinar slides be available? We are going to be today's presentation will be available in 48 hours on the nationalcouncil.org. So definitely check back there. The first questions that we have, I see coming in, are for you, Charlie. The first one I have is, how can I be HIPAA compliant while working from home?
Oh, well, thanks. Yeah, so we talked a little bit about that during the slide portion of the presentation. Watch out what's on your desk. Watch out what people can see on your screen. Make sure that you are, taking care of those papers and that sorts of thing. Be mindful of your voice, and just like David was just talking about, have that private space for you, and clients alike, where you can conduct your business, basically. The other thing to think about, though, are the technical safeguards. Do we have the proper equipment and the connections on a sort of an IT level to make sure that we have the right encryptions and all that sorts of geeky things to make sure that our personal and the PHI is all protected. The other thing to remember is on almost everything I talk about is about the policy. Make sure that we've got those policies in place that address those safeguards that we want to make sure that we have at home, so that the new normal is backed up with our policies and procedures.
Okay, perfect. The next question is also for you, Charlie. What are the best telehealth platforms to use at this time for HIPAA compliance? And can you please discuss any guidelines?
Well, there's a lot of different, gosh knows, I'm drawing a blank here. Sorry. There's a number of different software packages that are available for doing the telehealth. And there's a number that have been outlined in some technical documentation, some guidance from the government. And that's available on our COVID-19 website at our mtmservices.com. There's a link there. But what we've seen, we've done some nationwide surveys of clinicians that are using telehealth. And from them, what we see is they're using Teams or Skype, Zoom for healthcare, Doxy.me, GoToMeeting. Many are using self-hosted solutions. Now that may offer up some other technical things, but certainly a hosted solution is certainly something that you can do. As far as the guidelines, it takes me back to my HIPAA life, and I would say make sure you've got that BAA. I know that they've relaxed a lot of the business associates agreement requirements, at least in the short term for some of this, but make sure that the solution, whatever you choose, you're able to get that BAA so that we're able to make sure that we're able to cover that privacy. And that's all about the encryption, making sure that we've got that end-to-end encryption from the site of person 1 to the site of person 2 or 3 or 4 or 5.
Okay, perfect. I have one last question for you, Charlie. What's the best telehealth approach to indifferently integrate multiple person and personal organization on laptops, tablets, and phones?
Well, that's a great question, and it's really more murky. Unfortunately, the old expectation was that there would be multiple levels of security and compliance. We talked about making sure that you are checking in with your company-owned laptops and that sort of thing back into your system, and how are you making sure that you're doing that to make sure that we're compliant. We've got to make sure that we've got our, again, policies and procedures written in such a way that it accommodates our folks that are working from home, that are maybe using their home tablet or their home PC. And how do we validate that they have all of their updates up to date? How did we have, make sure that they've got antivirus and that sort of thing. Really, we've gone in a lot of ways from a few thousands of entry points to tens or hundreds of thousands of entry points. So be considerate of that. Make sure that your IT folks are doing what they can to reduce that risk as much as possible, but certainly make sure that also that you have it written into your policies and procedures what the expectations are. For example, your Wi-Fi needs to have a non-default password in it and a certain level of security, those sorts of things. Again, it's kind of the Wild West, but we're going to make it through.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. The next questions, I'm going to ask a couple to David. How can organizations ensure HIPAA and groups on Zoom, and how to address confidentiality on the client end?
Yes, thank you very much, Amanda, Amber. This is real important again, and I'm going to reiterate some of the things I mentioned already, and that is that it is our responsibility to protect HIPAA compliant information when someone comes to our office. So we still share some of that with the client, some of that responsibility when someone is receiving care, let's say from their own home via telehealth. So that's real important. I will speak to policies as well. So many of you, if you have been a client of mine in the last 5 or 6, 7 years for telehealth, what I've done is I've helped you to develop policies that help guide the staff and what they're able to do in order to really make that really successul. Don't forget 42 CFR Part 2 still applies when you're doing telehealth as well. And so these kind of norms are expected. So we just need to be very helpful to our clients to make sure that they have a secure and private place. I'm thinking, about some of the groups that I've done, particularly because this question did add groups in there, manage confidentiality on the client end. We've always been able to set norms with groups in person to make this real successful. When we have a group in person, we have 10 people, in the same room together. So if you invite 10 people to the same group room via telehealth together, all those same things apply. And that would be real important to make that helpful. So hopefully that's going to be good enough to help keep that protected health information there and at the client's end. But we need to help them, to guide them as best we possibly can to not let their private information get out to anybody else.
Okay, thank you. The next question I have is also for you, David. How can we provide services with organizations without having a signed PHI? Is verbal consent enough?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I suspect that the verbal consent comes from the temporary permission that we have been given during the whole pandemic response. So let's assume, as Charlie mentioned earlier, that's not going to last. So it's going to be very important for us to have signed consents. I'll also speak to policies around informed consent for telehealth treatment. So again, many of my organizations and clients I've worked with, they have all developed those kinds of policies. So none of this changes, none of the expectations changes because we're doing services through telehealth. It all is something that we have to get done. Let me mention that what's really important here is to be able to get client signatures and permission in writing. So so an organization and clinicians could use some of the new technologies that we have out there to get a written consent from a person for permission to transfer information and also consent to treatment. Examples of that are like DocuSign, and there are several others I know out there. I see that one a lot. I'm not recommending that any more than any other ones. It's just one that's on my mind, and I've seen it recently with several organizations that offers you the ability to get clients to sign electronically. So essentially everything can be electronic for them. They don't have to come into the presence of staff. So don't forget about the use of those kind of technologies to help a client to give written consent so that it's truly informed and that you have documents to support that.
Okay, thank you. I think the next couple of questions I have for you, Michael. The first one is, how are you addressing productivity in a COVID world, our current state, and how are you helping staff structure time in a remote setting?
That's a good question. I've been receiving that quite a lot, Amber. And I think one of the things to think about is the organization's key performance indicators really haven't changed. We've just adjusted where we're providing that service. So things like corporate compliance, things like the policy, procedures, the HIPAA, but even the expectations of when do I need to get my note done, my service delivery expectations, do treatment plans need to be updated? All of that answer is yes. So we have to think about both clinical and non-clinical team members. And so think about schedule rates. And so if you've seen a drop in performance, what is it around, scheduling clients? Do they have the technology? We're finding that most clients have some form of technology. If they can't, what are their service alternatives? Is there still somebody back at the office that can provide those services if the client does not have technology? So there's ways around that. As David said, is there somebody else? My client may not have technology. I'm working remotely, but I've got a colleague who at least goes into the office. I've seen that with many teams across the country, that at least somebody is at the office. And so what precautions are we taking in the office so maybe my consumer there can be seen at the office, or they can go into the office and have another be remotely from the office and I'm still at home. So there's some opportunities there. But thinking about in what way our support team professionals can help us meet some of those productivity expectations. So, look at our daily schedule rate. Think about kind of our backfill will call list. If I've got treatment plans that need to be updated, are those clients on my list that if I do have an opening today, or can I get those folks scheduled? Think about the role of centralized scheduling. In this, those teams that have really moved towards centralized scheduling, that has been a saving grace for many teams. One of my recent teams just moved to centralized scheduling, and that saved them, is really looking at being able to manage the schedule as opposed to having a schedule. So in what ways can we as supervisors, leaders, support our team in the field? If we've seen kind of our population drift off, then, we have to think about, if there's not enough clients to see, then I'm not going to meet goal. So thinking about same-day access in a telehealth environment. Our colleague Joy Fruth has done a series of webinars that are on the COVID page of really being able to move to true same-day access in a telehealth environment. So just because we're in telehealth doesn't mean we can't provide same-day access to many of our teams. But a lot of that has to do around structure. And having our support team professionals really help us meet that expectation. And so when we think about, helping our staff support that structure, they're really coming to work. So did they, as Charlie said, are they ready for work? Are they, ready to see clients? Or do I have my schedule for the day? Do I have my backup plan? What's my support team? And really having those touch bases, I think, with a lot of team members. I'm seeing frequent supervision, more frequent supervision of remote team members. So maybe a touch base in the morning or a debrief in the afternoon. How did it go today? Especially as we're help coaching them in this new environment.
Perfect, thank you. The next question I have for you, Michael, is how do you sell or inspire supervisees to continue collaborative documentation when the place of service is in telehealth?
Well, it's really interesting. What we found is I was talking with a team in New York recently, and they said that their staff that were a little resistant to collaborative documentation have now really truly leaned in and embracing collaborative documentation. You have to think one of the sort of the, and I'm using air quotes, is the resisting piece to collaborative is the computer. You know, the computer is the elephant in the room. I don't want to be rude and be working on my computer while the client's in the office. Remember, so the computer was the elephant in the room. Well, now the computer is the room. And so really using technology as an opportunity for the client to see what we're writing. Remember, nothing about me without me. So really helping our consumers structure, you know, the session. You know, what's the catch up in the middle, and then ignore, you know, the computer, pull up the screen where I can see you as my client, Amber, and then I'm going to pull up the note. I think when you think about even other questions around, you know, engaging, you know, children or adolescents in this process, adolescents want homework. Young children, we're probably working with more family members, but also having that, as David was saying, kind of structure that pre-service group. You know, so I'm going to meet with you about the group expectations and group norms. If you've got a family member with a small child and they're kind of struggling to support that child in that home, and there's other family members there, one of the things you want to do is have that pre-session, right? You're going to talk with mom or dad or grandma or foster parent and say, hey, we're going to have our session. This is kind of what we're expecting. And so what can the other kids be doing in the time? You know, realize everybody's in the same house. We've got, you know, homeschooling going on at the same time. There's a lot of balls in the air for many of our families. So how can we help them structure this? So I need to meet with you and Johnny, and we have to have a safe space for you guys to work in. Or I need to work with Johnny, and you need to work with the other kids for right now. So being able to have what I would call that anticipatory guidance. Remember the need for homework. Remember that part of the things we talk about with collaborative documentation with even young children is to have my activity bag ready. I was talking with a team recently, and one of their clinicians is actually sending her clients color sheets and, you know, via email, or the things that they can do together, or virtual tic-tac-toe, or, you know, just because when we used to do play therapy in the office, how do we do a virtual app together that we can keep, you know, how do we use technology in this process of what we do? So really helping kind of inspire our team members to do collaborative documentation, because I think some of the things, remember that on average, if you're not doing collaborative documentation, staff are spending about 8 to 10 hours a week in post-session documentation, which means they were logging in from home. So collaborative documentation is also a staff self-care tool. If I can get my note done in session with the individual or family present, even if I'm working from home, which means now I can be more attentive in home. My commute is less, so now I can actually, you know, leave my home office, you know, and be engaging with my family. My note is done. I don't have to log in later and get my note done. And so really be mindful. And it's also a way, collaborative documentation is really also a way to really help, even going to the previous question around productivity. I've noticed the teams that are doing collaborative, their clients are more engaged. And that, so they're seeing really no dip in productivity at this point. Actually, some teams are seeing a decrease in no-shows. They're seeing an increase in client attendance, especially for some of their more distant clients that I had to drive 2 hours to see your house, you know, to go to you, to see you, those kinds of things. So I think it's important to really help support our team members of why this is important for consumers and families that we work with, but also as a staff self-care tool in these very stressful times.
And Michael, I actually have a follow-up to your last question. I think you hit on it a little bit, but how do you increase use of collaborative documentation, and what techniques are useful for remote supervision?
I think, you know, as supervisors, we're always modeling, right? As a supervisor, we're always in a bubble. Everybody's watching what we do and what we don't do. So if I'm having supervision with you today, Amber, I'm going to pull up our supervision log today. I'm going to go over some of the things that you're doing, you know, well, some of the challenges you might be experiencing, help you develop solutions or have you come to me with solutions with some of those expectations. But increasing the use of collaborative, you know, in remote supervision is to model that. And so work with me a little bit around technology. Maybe I need to, you know, part of our supervision next week, I need to bring Charlie into our meeting, so, you know, or your IT team to help you walk through your technology. You know, help your team members be, I think, supportive of the new environment. What questions do they have? Who else can we bring in? Do I need to bring in our chief compliance officer? Remember, compliance hasn't gone away. Our corporate compliance hasn't gone away. So the quality of the note, we're going to review your telenotes. Are they as good as they were in the office? And if there's a variance there, what can I do to help be supportive that you can get that job done during our work hours, again, through collaborative documentation, but introduce this as something new. Develop your scripts to really help the clinicians support that. But as a supervisor, manager, help brainstorm and solution solve that, and practice with me, role play in supervision of the new technology. Practice your scripts. My colleague Kyle Karen and I did a webinar on the COVID page to talk about supervising in a remote environment. And that might be something for you and your supervisee to review and then discuss it.
All right, thank you. This next question is for you, David. What are some best practices around crisis management?
Yes, thanks. And that's another great question about best practices. So earlier, I spoke about, about having successive options for the clinician to make contact with someone else to be able to help a client that might be experiencing a crisis. Let me say that's just one example of a crisis opportunity. We have telehealth have been used for years to provide crisis services. I'm recalling years ago in the state of Missouri, mobile crisis teams that I helped to get started, and those in North Carolina, they were using tablets like iPads and different kind of 4G at that time, and now we have 5G technology to link in psychiatric providers, for example, when a team would go to a location just because that a client has a crisis. And they would go see that client wherever they were at. And if they needed backup help, like medication management, for example, they could get that through telehealth in a crisis mode. So there's other examples of things like that are these emerging practices to make this happen. I would also say that this is kind of wrapping it around a lot of other things, but you would want to credential your clinicians to be telehealth providers. Now, I realize again that most organizations got thrust into this really fast in the last 2.5 to 3 months. Many of the people that I talked to said we had to turn this thing on a dime. We had hundreds of employees that went to teleworking, and that happened in 3 to 4 days, and telehealth started right after that. So you didn't have a chance to properly screen people, screen your professionals to see what they would, how successful they might be. Some of the things that Michael just mentioned are just critical that you would want to understand, but let me add to that around crisis. How well can a person manage a clinical crisis for a client, with a client, via telehealth? What would you look for? Have they been trained to do that? Have they received any kind of crisis management training? Are they well informed of all of the involuntary commitment proceedings and processes within their jurisdiction or their state? Those things are going to be real important to know when you have an option, or when you have an opportunity to help a person manage a crisis. I would even say a little bit of a written protocol would be really helpful. So when this happens, what is it that we normally do? And the first thing that people might think of is to call 911 and have someone dispatched. And that still may be the option, but as I said earlier, I think that's probably a last resort. What other options can we do in order to help a person to manage? Michael said it earlier too, we're always in the assessment mode. This is about the golden thread of documentation or the clinical function. So every time we see a person, via telehealth or in person, we're always reassessing. It always starts with that. And so every time that we see someone with telehealth, we should reassess what is their crisis risk today at this point in time. Is there anything that we need to be aware of, again, to get ahead of this? And I just closed my comments about that, about the prevention. I think the real emerging practices on here are that can we identify people that are going to be emerging in a crisis, and what would we do about that? So I'm well familiar with organizations that it may be at the end of every day, but in particular, it's at the end of every week, that every one of the clinicians is reporting on their clients that week that they have had some type of person who they're concerned about. So they're raising the crisis questions. They're raising the crisis suspicion about a particular person. Maybe they have more than one, and they're forwarding that to their on-call staff or their crisis staff in the event that they have an emerging crisis that they're going to need. So this is in the same way we can do the same thing about that.
All right, great, thank you. We have a question about open access and no-show rates. I would encourage you to attend the second part or part 2 of this webinar. It's happening tomorrow, May 13th at 1 p.m. And that issue will be addressed in detail during that webinar. So definitely check it out. You can go to the nationalcouncil.org events page and register for the event. Okay, the next question. This can be for Charlie or Michael. What if an employer is not providing everything that's needed for HIPAA compliance?
Well,
Charlie, why don't you start with that?
Well, I think that ultimately the HIPAA compliance comes back to us as employees, and and I'm not sure what the employer might not be providing for the HIPAA compliance. Maybe they're not providing you with equipment or something like that. Otherwise, I would say, it's kind of incumbent on you to make a good faith effort to try to be as compliant with personal health information as you can with, in your home. That means not saving any information to any of your private or your own equipment. It's just, it's kind of a tough one. Michael, you got anything to add to that?
Well, I think part of that is, do I have a bring your own device policy? Going back to David's policy and procedure component, what's my policy on using my own device? Is there kind of a burn factor on my phone, or, if I am using my own equipment, if I'm using my own laptop, I'm using my own cell phone, again, has it been approved by IT that my virus protection is up to date, my malware is up to date? One of the things that Charlie does with us on a regular basis is, he'll remote in on our devices and make sure that we're up to speed, we've got everything we need, and that we're cool in running, what we need to do. And so even having your IT folks, dial into your device, and there's ways to do that, but it really goes back to policy and procedure. It's also leadership's responsibility to make sure team members have what they need to do to work remotely. And if I can't work remotely, then I've got to come back to the office, and I've got to make sure that I'm safe in that. I think part of when we think about even coming back to the office at any point, the first thing is safety. And so that even working remotely, the first thing is safety. It's HIPAA safety. It's, as David was saying about crisis safety with our consumers, the first thing in all of this is safety.
Great. So we have about 2 minutes left, and I just want to ask one more question that we can kind of quickly answer. This is from Michael or David. Do you have any advice for using telehealth with children and adolescents, or when there are multiple children and a caregiver is struggling to manage supporting the child during their telehealth session?
So I'll start with that, David, and then I'll hand it off to you really quickly. I think first is having that pre-session, having that session with the caregiver to make sure that when we set up and have that conversation that we are ready to go. A lot of my team members right now, they're doing collaborative with young children. A lot of it is a little bit with the child and then maybe more with the family. So you might have to restructure the session a little bit. Maybe a 15, 20 minutes with the child, and then another 40 minutes, with the adult, and then the last 10 minutes back together. And so really thinking about in what way can the family member, the caregiver do to help support that child in that environment. I think it's also the ability, going back to David's support around, having that private space. If, can I bring somebody in, or is there anybody else in the house that can help care for children while I'm working with the clinician and my younger child in their session? Or what can I do to have a family or parent session alone without the child to help have them support? David?
Well, and I think, Michael, all those were great comments, and I'd only add just one, and I think that is that you have to find the structure is the way to engage with the child and or the caregivers, the guardians, or the parents. So you have to be able to engage using telehealth. It's very similar to what teachers are having to do right now, you know, and the whole age group of the child is going to be one of the factors. The younger the child, the more difficult it's going to be to get the child to focus and to engage via any kind of a telehealth without any support on site. So that's that pre-meeting. How do you create the structure to do that? So I think a little bit more structure for children than I do for adults makes this more successful.
Mm-hmm. And I think being able to have that session with mom or caregiver and the child and say, this is our work with David, who's our counselor at ABC Center. This is not FaceTime with grandma. And being able, what's the difference between the two? You know, this is not a Zoom family meeting. This is different. This is not Zoom family game night. And so in what way can we do that? I was working with a team recently, and they're saying that, again, you know, can we send something to the child to do? Remember having your activity bag ready. But also remember, adolescents want homework of their session. What can I work on between now and next week? You know, and so that's, what can I journal about? What can I, you know, document between now and next week? What's the plan for next week? And so helping support that adolescent or child in that new environment. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, and this is also the reason why that I said that CBT, the cognitive behavioral techniques, often work for people using telehealth because of that same thing. It actually adds a level of structure to any telehealth. So that's always good for kids too. Of course, everything would be age appropriate.
Okay, thank you. And we're at time, but I do want to allow for our speakers to, you know, have any closing comments, quick comments for you guys.
I think one of the things to think about is, you know, using that rapid cycle change. As David said, many of you have done tremendous work in moving your teams to a telehealth environment. Would have taken, you know, 6, 7, 8 months to plan and work through. You guys did in yeoman's work in like 3 to 5 days, and really moving your entire system of care to a remote environment. And I think congratulations to all of you for making sure that you and your team members and your community are safe. But the use of rapid cycle change, the use of plan, do, study, act, what's working, what's not. Just because we started telehealth 3 weeks ago doesn't mean we can't continue to retweak that in a PDSA environment. Keep always looking in ways to enhance your team members and enhance the service of those you serve.
And I'll just go next. I think that the whole response to the virus and the pandemic has been a great disruptor, and it's disrupted our system, and we have responded. Now I think it's time to get the policies in place and the procedures in place to ensure that it's a safe process that we have for the future, because I think it's going to be with us for a long period of time. This is not going to just go away and everything's going to return to normal, that we're going to be seeing people in the office all the time again. I think as our CMS director has said recently, that the genie has been let out of the bottle, and it's going to be very hard to get it back. So I think this is here to stay, and we should perfect it and get it really good.
And just in closing, I would just say that, you know, like my predecessors before me here have said, you know, really this technology is here to stay. The trick is that we've got to make it as transparent as possible so that it doesn't become a telehealth visit. It just is a visit. We just happen to go into the office today, or we just happen to do it over, you know, in our hand. So how can we make sure that we've got the technology in place, those policies and procedures in place, so that we can make it that sort of seamless delivery of care?
All right, thank you all to our speakers today, and thank you for everyone who attended today's webinar. A recording and the slides of today's webinar will be on the nationalcouncil.org events archive page within 48 hours. Thank you once again, and please have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.